You don't have to sit alone, the little girl said gently. Daniel Carter didn't look up. I do, he said quietly, his voice tired and rough. I want to sit alone. So don't worry about me, okay? You shouldn't be talking to strangers anyway. He expected her to leave. Instead, the small voice came a little closer. There's still space on the bench. Could I sit here for a little bit? I'm waiting for my mom, and she told me to stay where she can see me. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, then shifted slightly to the side. Fine, he said. You can sit, but I'm not very good company. That's okay, she said as she climbed onto the bench beside him. I can be good company for both of us. For a moment, they sat in silence. Snow fell softly. People walked past carrying wrapped gifts and cups of hot chocolate. A group near the fountain began singing Christmas carols, slightly off-key but happy. The little girl noticed the papers in Daniel's hands. She leaned a little closer, careful, polite, not touching, just looking. She could see the hospital logo at the top, lines of words she didn't understand, and a diagram of a heart. Are you waiting for someone? She asked gently. Daniel stared at the papers for a long moment before answering, I was. The girl tilted her head. Were? The person I was waiting for, he said slowly. Decided she didn't want to wait with me anymore, so she left. The girl looked at the papers again. Is it because you're sick? Daniel gave a small, tired smile. You're very observant. It says heart right there, she said, pointing with her mitten. And you look like my mama did when the doctor told her she was sick. Daniel turned and looked at her more carefully now. Your mom is sick? She nodded. Yeah, but she still works, and she still makes Christmas. Daniel looked down at the papers again, then folded them slowly and held them in his lap. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Then the little girl said softly, You know, you don't have to sit here by yourself. I can sit with you, and if you want, you can tell me what happened. My mama says talking makes the heavy stuff a little lighter. Daniel let out a long breath through his nose. He didn't know why, but it suddenly felt very hard to keep everything inside. I got these this morning, he said, tapping the papers lightly. Test results. The doctor says, my heart is very sick. The girl listened without interrupting, and when my girlfriend heard, he continued, his voice tightening slightly, she decided she didn't want to be with a man who might spend a lot of time in hospitals. She said she didn't sign up for that. Then she picked up her bag and walked out. The words sounded flat in the cold air, like something that had already happened to someone else. So, Daniel said quietly, looking out at the lights. I didn't feel like going home tonight. I didn't feel like going to a party or pretending to be okay. So I came here. I guess I just ended up spending Christmas Eve on a bench. The little girl was very quiet for a moment. Then she said, That's a very bad day. Daniel gave a short laugh. Yeah, it really is. She swung her legs gently and looked straight ahead, just like he was doing. Then she turned to him and spoke very gently. You're sick, she said, and you think people will leave because of that. But my mama was sick before too, so I understand a little. When someone you love is sick, it's scary, but it also means they need people more, not less. Daniel looked at her, surprised by the calm way she said it. So, she continued, if you come to our house tonight, it will be you and me and my mama, 3 people. We'll sit at the table together, and you won't have to sit on this bench by yourself thinking about sad things. He shook his head slowly. No, I don't think that's a good idea. The girl frowned a little. Why not? Because, he said quietly, I'm a sick man, and when people find out you're sick, they leave. It's easier that way. I don't want to show up at your house and then disappear one day. You're just a kid. You don't need that. The little girl listened very carefully. Then she held out her mittened hand. My name is Annie, she said. I forgot to tell you before. He looked at her small hand, then shook it gently. Daniel. Okay, Daniel, Annie said. Now we're not strangers anymore. She scooted a little closer on the bench. My mama says when someone is sick, that's when you sit closer, not farther away, she said. So if you're sick, then you should sit with us on Christmas. 3 people can share the sad and make it smaller. And you won't have to be alone. Daniel felt his throat tighten again. You said the person you were waiting for left, Annie continued softly. But we're not leaving. We're right here, and if you come eat with us, then tonight you'll have a family table instead of a cold bench. Across the street, the grocery store door opened, and a woman stepped out carrying 2 heavy bags. She looked around quickly, searching the park, then spotted Annie and started walking toward them. Annie waved. "That's my mama," she said, then looked back at Daniel. "Come meet her. And if you still want to sit alone after that, you can, but you don't have to." Sarah Williams noticed the man before she reached the bench. "Annie," Sarah called gently as she walked toward them, grocery bags heavy in her hands. "Honey, I told you to stay where I could see you." "I did, Mama," Annie said quickly, running to take one of the bags from her. "I was right here. And I made a friend." Sarah's eyes moved to Daniel. He stood straight, polite, like a man who had been raised to respect mothers. "I'm sorry if I worried you," he said. "She just came and sat with me. I hope that was all right." Before Sarah could answer, Annie spoke quickly, like she was afraid the moment might disappear if she didn't explain everything. "Mama, this is Daniel. He had a very bad day. The doctor said his heart is sick, and the lady he loves left him, so he was going to sit alone on Christmas. But I told him he didn't have to." Sarah blinked, surprised by the honesty of that introduction, but Daniel gave a small, embarrassed smile. "She's not wrong," he said quietly. Sarah looked at him more carefully now, really seeing him. The pale face, the tired eyes, the envelope in his hand that looked like hospital paperwork. She softened immediately, the way women do when they recognize real pain. "Well," she said gently, "Christmas Eve is a hard night to spend alone." "Yes, ma'am," Daniel said quietly. "It is." Annie tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mama, I told him he can come have Christmas with us," she said, "so he won't be alone." Sarah looked at Daniel, and for a moment he thought she might say no, that she would take Annie's hand and walk away, and this strange, fragile moment would end right here on the sidewalk. But Sarah just said, "We don't have much, just a small dinner, but no one should be alone on Christmas." Daniel opened his mouth to politely refuse again, and that was when he saw her. Across the street, walking under the Christmas lights, was Vanessa. She was wearing the white coat he had bought her last winter, her hand wrapped around the arm of a tall man in a gray scarf. They were laughing about something, walking close together, like people who had plans later. Vanessa looked up. She saw Daniel. For a split second, she froze. Then her expression changed into something between annoyance and amusement, like she had just run into an inconvenient memory. "Well," she said as she and the man walked up to the sidewalk where Daniel, Annie, and Sarah stood. "I didn't expect to see you here." Daniel looked at her hand on the other man's arm, then back at her face. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I didn't expect to see you either, not so soon." Vanessa shrugged slightly. "Life moves on," she said. "You should try it." Daniel let out a small, humorless breath. "This morning," he said, "you told me you couldn't be with a man who might spend time in hospitals, and tonight you're already out celebrating. If this story touched your heart, please like this video and leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next story. Your support helps us keep telling stories that matter." She smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. "Daniel, you're rich, not naive. The world doesn't stop because you get sick. I told you the truth. Most people would have just slowly disappeared." The man beside her looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Vanessa glanced at Annie and Sarah briefly, then back at Daniel. "You'll be fine," she said lightly. "Men like you always are. Just hire the best doctors money can buy." Then she turned, looped her arm more tightly through the other man's arm, and said over her shoulder, "Merry Christmas, Daniel." And just like that, she walked away. For a moment, no one spoke. Annie didn't understand what had just happened, but she could feel the sadness again, heavy and quiet beside her. She slipped her small hand into Daniel's hand without saying anything. Sarah said softly, "I'm sorry. That must have been very hard." Daniel watched until Vanessa disappeared into the crowd. Then he looked down at Annie's small hand holding his. "You know," he said slowly, his voice quieter but steadier than before, "I think I changed my mind." Annie looked up. "About what?" "About sitting alone tonight," he said. Her face lit up immediately. "So you'll come have Christmas with us?" Daniel nodded once. "Yeah," he said, "if your mom is really sure." Sarah gave him a gentle smile. I'm sure. Annie grinned and grabbed his hand with both of hers now. See? I told you. You don't have to sit alone. They started walking toward the apartment. Daniel had eaten in some of the most expensive dining rooms in the world. He had sat under crystal chandeliers in New York, across polished tables in Paris, in private rooms where waiters spoke in quiet voices and poured wine that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He had discussed million-dollar deals over plates that looked more like art than food. But none of those meals stayed in his memory the way this one did. The apartment was warm, the windows slightly fogged from the heat of the oven. The small Christmas tree in the corner leaned exactly the way Annie had promised, as if it had tried its best and then just decided that was good enough. Paper ornaments hung beside old glass ones, and a string of popcorn wrapped around the branches in uneven loops. It leans more every year, Annie said proudly as Daniel looked at it. Mama says it has personality. I think it has perseverance, Daniel said. It refuses to fall even when life pushes it. Sarah smiled a little at that as she set the plates on the table. That tree and I have something in common, she said. They sat down together, the three of them around the small table. Annie insisted Daniel sit in the chair closest to the tree. So you can be in the Christmas corner, she explained. The food was simple, but it smelled wonderful. Roast chicken, macaroni and cheese, and sweet potatoes with melted marshmallows on top, just like Annie had promised. Daniel looked at the plate for a moment before picking up his fork. I can't remember the last time I had dinner at a table like this, he said. Sarah sat across from him. What kind of table do you usually eat at? He thought about it. Long conference tables, kitchen counters, airplane trays, alone, most of the time, a quiet one, he said finally. Annie frowned slightly. Quiet is okay, she said. But not on Christmas. They began to eat, and for a few minutes Annie did most of the talking. She told Daniel about her school, about how she liked reading but not math, about how her mom worked a lot but still came to every school play even if she was tired. Daniel listened to every word like it mattered, because to Annie, it did. Halfway through dinner, Sarah looked at him and said gently, You don't have to tell us anything you don't want to, but sometimes it helps to say things out loud. Daniel set his fork down for a moment. He wasn't used to talking about himself unless it was business. Numbers, plans, strategies, those things were easy. Feelings were not. This morning, he said slowly, I went to the hospital for some tests. I thought it was just stress. I work too much. Don't sleep enough. I figured the doctor would tell me to take a vacation. Sarah listened quietly, but instead, he continued. He told me my heart is weak, that I might need surgery, that if I don't take it seriously, I might not have as much time as I thought. Annie had stopped eating now, watching him carefully, and when I told Vanessa, he said, staring at the table, she looked at me like I had just ruined her future. She said she didn't want to spend her life in hospitals and waiting rooms. Then she left. The room was very quiet now except for the soft hum of the heater. I think, Daniel said after a moment, that was the moment I realized something. I have a very big house. I have a very big company. I have a lot of money, but I don't actually have anyone who would sit in a hospital waiting room for me. Annie slid her small hand across the table and placed it on top of his. I would, she said simply. Daniel looked at her, his eyes suddenly burning again. I'm serious, Annie continued. I'm very good at waiting. I wait for Mama all the time when she works late. Sarah reached over and squeezed Annie's shoulder gently, then looked at Daniel. You don't know us, she said, but I know what it feels like to sit in a doctor's office and hear bad news. And I know what it feels like to be afraid and still go home and cook dinner and keep going because someone is counting on you. Daniel nodded slowly. You understand more than most people I know. Sarah gave a small, sad smile. Life teaches some people earlier than others. They finished dinner, and Annie insisted Daniel help her put a star on top of the leaning tree. He had to stand on a small step stool while Annie held the tree steady and Sarah laughed softly from the couch. Perfect, Annie said when the star was finally straight. Now it's a proper Christmas. Later, they sat in the living room with mugs of hot chocolate. Annie sat on the floor with crayons, drawing very seriously on a piece of paper. Daniel looked around the apartment again. It was small, a little worn, but everywhere he looked there were signs that someone cared. Clean dishes drying on a towel, a stack of library books, a photo of Annie and Sarah taped to the wall. You built a good life here, he said quietly to Sarah. She followed his gaze around the room. I built a safe life, she said. That was the goal. That's harder, he said. Annie suddenly stood up and walked over, holding her drawing. I made something, she announced. She handed the paper to Daniel. It was a drawing of a small house with a crooked Christmas tree beside it. 3 stick figures stood in front of the house holding hands. One was tall, one medium, one small. Above them was a big yellow star. That's you, Annie said, pointing to the tall stick figure. And that's Mama. And that's me. Daniel stared at the drawing for a long moment. You drew me very tall, he said quietly. You are tall, Annie said, and you look less sad when you're standing next to us. He swallowed and nodded, unable to speak for a second. Can I tell you something, Daniel? Annie asked. Of course. She climbed up onto the couch beside him. When I saw you on the bench, she said, you looked like you were lost. Not like you didn't know where the park was, but like you didn't know where your people were. Daniel felt that sentence land somewhere deep inside him. And now? He asked softly. Annie leaned her head lightly against his arm. Now you found us, she said. So you're not lost tonight. Daniel looked at Sarah, and she held his gaze for a moment. There was no pressure in her eyes, no expectation, just a quiet understanding, and a kind of strength he hadn't seen in a long time. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the city in white. Inside the small apartment, the leaning tree glowed softly, and a 6-year-old girl sat beside a man with a broken heart and acted like it was the most normal thing in the world. For the first time in months, Daniel did not think about the test results in his coat pocket. For the first time in a very long time, he thought about something else instead. He thought about what it might feel like to belong somewhere. Daniel did not leave right after dinner. At first, he told himself he would stay just long enough to be polite. Long enough to finish the hot chocolate Annie insisted on making extra sweet because it's Christmas. Long enough to thank Sarah properly for the meal. Long enough to step back out into the cold and return to his large, silent house where nothing waited for him except expensive furniture and unopened mail. But time moved differently in that small apartment. Annie sat cross-legged on the floor, carefully coloring the drawing she had made earlier. Every now and then she would look up to make sure Daniel was still there, like she didn't quite trust that he wouldn't disappear if she looked away too long. Sarah stood at the sink washing dishes, her movement slow and steady. Daniel stood up automatically after a few minutes and walked over. Let me help, he said. She shook her head. You're a guest. I haven't been a guest in someone's home in a very long time, he replied. I'd like to earn my dinner. She handed him a towel. All right, she said. You can dry. They worked side by side in comfortable silence for a few minutes. It was the kind of silence that didn't feel empty. The kind that felt like two people sharing the same space without needing to fill every second with words. You don't talk like most people I know, Sarah said after a while. Daniel glanced at her. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? It means you're not trying to impress anyone, she said. Most people who have money make sure you know it within 5 minutes. He gave a small smile. Most people who know I have money treat me differently within 5 minutes, so sometimes it's easier not to mention it. She studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly like that answer made sense. When the dishes were done, Annie ran over and grabbed Daniel's hand. Come see the tree when the lights are off, she said. It looks better in the dark. She turned off the lamp, and the room fell into a soft glow from the Christmas lights alone. The little tree leaned in the corner, glowing gold and red and green, reflecting in the window like there were 2 trees instead of 1. It's beautiful, Daniel said quietly. Annie leaned against his side. Mama says Christmas isn't about how big the tree is.